This is the second PowerPoint for Week 3 of History 213, and it covers the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. As the Constitution was finally ratified by the necessary number of states, the United States government began, and on April 30th, 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States. We've been looking at the artwork in the rotunda. Everything we've been looking at previously was on the walls. This, though, is way up high on the interior of the dome. The apotheosis of Washington. Apotheosis means to deify, to be made into a god. I remember when I was in D.C. in the 90s and I looked up at this, not expecting to see anything like this. And then I read about it and I was a little surprised. But this is George Washington being received into heaven. We had an opportunity to look at George Washington when we studied the beginning of the French and Indian War, which he was responsible for igniting, though it would have probably happened anyway. George Washington was a son of his father's second wife, and his father died when he was 11. His brother Lawrence Washington, resident of Mount Vernon Plantation, was his role model. But Lawrence died in 1752 when George was 20. Mount Vernon would later pass to George. George eventually, at a young age, headed west to the frontier town of Winchester, Virginia, at age 16, and began surveying work for Lord Fairfax and for the Ohio Company. Fairfax and two of George's brothers were investors in the company, and Fairfax owned, amazingly, about 25% of the land of Virginia. In fact, of all those who owned colonial land, Fairfax was the only British aristocrat who actually came to the colonies and took up residence. Washington never received formal training as a surveyor, though he did exhibit dedication to hard work. Not well educated, and the lower-ranking son in a modestly placed gentry family, Washington's only route to social advancement was through the military. As a youth, time with his well-respected military brother Lawrence, who married a Fairfax, allowed him access to social gatherings, protocol, and connections. In these situations, Washington learned how to act within the privileged social world of Virginia. Due to his connections in high places, at age 20, George was made a major over a Virginia district, though he in fact had no formal military training. Beginning at the age of only 21, Washington successfully gained military assignments against the French, partly due to his surveying knowledge of the western frontier. Through the years, Washington carefully guarded and molded his military record and reputation and shortcomings, as we know from the Fort Necessity incident. Due to his surveying background, Washington looked to land speculation and tenant rents to establish his future wealth. He maintained a network of confidential frontier contacts, usually military men with whom he'd had previous associations, who often sought out the best land for him, outmaneuvering others, even when it was against the law or contrary to agreements with officers who served with him. He was updated on his far-flung properties at times during even the Revolutionary War. His land agents included William Crawford, a well-known Pennsylvania frontiersman, Michael Cresap of Maryland fame, and John Armstrong. I give you a list of his properties, or a link to it, of the properties in his will, which is kind of interesting. John Armstrong was also strongly connected with Pennsylvania, and Michael Cresap one of those frontiersmen who gained a lot of knowledge about fighting on the frontier, riflemen. And initially, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, it was Cressup showing up with a number of his fellow frontiersmen in moccasins and with their guns, who actually made a big difference at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Washington's financial situation was secured for a number of years when he married Martha Custis, one of the wealthiest widows in the colonies. They had no children, but he became the stepfather of her 2 children from her previous marriage. As we see through these children, eventually General Robert E. Lee will inherit Arlington. There's a lot of time in between when George was young and led those men at Fort Necessity, and then when he took over as the head of the Continental Army for the Revolution. And what did George do during that time? This helps out a little bit. After the French and Indian Wars, which he helped start, and in which he
Washington's discomfort with
political work while serving in the House of Burgesses
life
is well attested.
routine.
And I should note
He preferred his
Washington
land affairs
never
and
became a
plantation
great
businesses.
battlefield strategist.
He finally,
The one thing he
in
always
a letter
was
in
very
1769 to
brave.
George Mason, showed an interest
Unelected in
the
his first
colonial
attempt for
crisis.
political office in 1755,
In the letter,
he eventually
he
became a
personally
member
recommended
of Virginia's
himself
House
for
of
a military
Burgesses
leadership
for the
position
Winchester area
if
in about
the crisis should come
1758.
to that.
Though he served in the House of Burgesses
As
without
poor as his
distinction.
record was in battlefield
He
strategy,
enjoyed a good reputation, though.
Washington's
had a successful
reputation
grain
was high.
business and collected rents
Doubtless,
from his
he was an
tenant
incredibly
farmers
brave
who were
leader
on the
who
lands
engendered
he
respect
owned.
from those who served with him.
In 1775,
Goes back
he
to
was appointed
European
general
feudalism.
over the Continental
He sometimes
Army.
spent evenings.
Washington's record as a battlefield tactician is not strong. His strong point was retreat. His strength as leader of the Continental Army was his endurance and dedication to the cause and his attention to detail. His time in the House of Burgesses demonstrated that he was a resolved thinker, but not a quick thinker. And he won the respect of both his men and Congress. He was a fair man, though demanding when dealing with others. Coming upon some Quakers made prisoners for refusing to fight, he even recognized some of them from his Winchester days, he told them to go back home and grow as much food as they could for the cause of the colonies, which demonstrates Washington's growing understanding of people for whom participating in war was against their conscience. Though Washington remained an old Whig in his belief in traditional social status, he did develop over the years, through his experiences in the Winchester area and through events such as the winter at Valley Forge, a respect for most people and a good sense of what a free country entailed. However, he only freed his slaves after his death. He had many slaves. When residing as president in Philadelphia, he rotated his personal slaves in and out every 6 months, as Pennsylvania law declared free any slave resident in Pennsylvania for more than 6 months. After the war in 1784, Washington headed west to western Pennsylvania to inspect lands on the frontier. In other words, he went back to business. And he could do that up until 1787 when he was selected to oversee the Constitutional Convention. Interested in the land of western Pennsylvania, which was really the major frontier at the time, near the Monongahela River, he met with a number of settlers who came to meet with the renowned general at a little cabin. One of those present was a young Albert Gallatin, who, through his romantic desire to live in nature, had settled out along the Monongahela. Washington, in the tiny cabin and surrounded by the onlooking settlers, took his time inspecting a map of the area for the best route for a new road. Gallatin grew impatient, waiting, and burst out, "Oh, it is perfectly clear where the best place is." Washington gave the young man a severe stare, and then, inspecting the map further, looked up at Gallatin and said, "You, sir, are right." The 2 men talked and spent the night in the cabin, Washington on the bed, and Gallatin on the floor. And thus we have the meeting of Gallatin and Washington. Washington would even offer Gallatin a position, and Gallatin declined. He was busy getting his own life going out on the frontier. When Washington took office in 1789, the United States was largely rural, with approximately 80% of all households involved in agriculture, and that's not surprising. This was much more common in the South, where southern plantation owners made their living growing and selling crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. And cotton production rose dramatically in about a 25-year period. Much of this work was done by African Americans. The 1790 census that is demanded by the Constitution counted some 750,000 African Americans in the U.S., more than 90% of these living in the 5 southernmost states, and most were slaves. Massachusetts and the rest of New England tended to focus on the seaports and manufacturing that went along with life there. The middle states had a more balanced economy and boasted the largest cities. Indeed, the only really large city at the time is Philadelphia. The final point is important. Thus, the nation as a whole, even at this point, was diverse, each ascribing to different social and economic philosophies. One thing, though, that is very important to recognize about the United States, even before the war with England was over, is that people were on the move. And this slide notes that they're moving, especially via the route from Pennsylvania and Winchester, Virginia, to western Pennsylvania, where they can meet up with the Ohio River. The Ohio River begins at Pittsburgh, which was Fort Duquesne before, and it is made by the merging of the Monongahela River and the Allegheny River. That's why it's called the Three Rivers area. Two large rivers flow together to create the Ohio, which then flows all the way to the Mississippi, which will flow all the way to New Orleans and out to the ocean. So it's an important route and trade route as well. This slide notes the formation of the first cabinet for the president, and the two most important people are the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. And those two, both brilliant, do not get along. We're now moving into what you're going to write about this week in a PowerPoint, and that is the Hamiltonian economics. These men acted in many respects as an advisory board for the president, but as hindsight has shown us, this first cabinet was far from harmonious. In matters of economics, Washington turned to his cabinet for advice, but found both men on opposite sides of the spectrum. On the one hand, you had a Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, who supported a strong centralized government and a loose construction of the Constitution, while Jefferson was the opposite. As one of the most affluent founding fathers and Washington's right-hand man during the Revolution, Hamilton was well respected, but his term as Secretary of Treasury brought him into stark and bitter rivalry with both Thomas Jefferson and his once ally James Madison. In fact, Jefferson and Madison began forming an alliance. Unlike the two Virginians, Jefferson and Madison, Hamilton's goal for the United States was to increase the size of the central government by creating a strong economic system based on protectionist tariffs. That is, anybody who wants, another nation who wants to import goods into the U.S. Has to pay money to do so. Protectionist tariffs, taxation, and accumulation of a national debt, the growth of manufacturing, and the development of a national bank. This slide looks at Hamilton on the government's power to raise money, Madison's disagreement, And nonetheless, and by the way, Madison is in the House of Representatives at this time, Hamilton proposed 3 programs for economic development. The first of these programs he called the First Report on Public Credit in 1790. Hamilton recommended that the government provide new interest rates for people who held government bonds, and the second was that the government assume all debts incurred as a result of the war. The second portion of this plan provided for a national debt, which Hamilton saw as a positive good so long as it was not excessive. He argued that a debt would allow for maintaining high taxation and other protectionist tariffs. For Hamilton, this strategy would increase the prestige of the government while also gaining support of wealthy creditors. Hamilton's plan was largely unpopular, especially in the South, because they had already paid off their debt. They weren't going to benefit from this. But despite opposition by Madison and others, it passed in the House. As the measure concerned the accumulation of state debts, that is from the war, Hamilton, at least initially, was less successful. When debates reached Congress, Madison supported Hamilton's plan, but rather than assume the debts as they currently stood, he argued that they should assume them as they stood in 1783, 7 years previous. So, what normally occurs in politics, because it is a discipline of compromise, Hamilton eventually made a compromise with Jefferson and Madison, and it concerned where the capital would be located. Hamilton proposed to gain enough northern votes to move the capital into the Virginia area if Madison could gain enough southern votes to pass Hamilton's Assumption Bill. The second proposal was to create the Bank of the United States, again opposed by the Jefferson-Madison coalition. Hamilton argued it was just fine to have a national bank. Despite criticism from the Jefferson and Madison coalition, the bill was passed and signed by Washington, and the first national bank opened. Hamilton's third proposal was his report on manufacturers. For Hamilton, manufacturing was necessary for the growth of the U.S., and he believed that an increase in manufacturing would benefit the nation in many ways. And it is almost axiomatic today that a nation's economy grows with manufacturing and industry. Despite his efforts, only a few of his ideas were enacted in 1792, while the others were filed away. Hamilton's economic policy indeed favored the more aristocratic and those individuals with some sort of wealth. Beneficiaries of his economic bills were not the common man. Well, not directly anyway. One of the most significant results of the opposition to Hamiltonian economics was the creation of political parties. This slide notes, in a sense, how Jefferson differed in a number of ways from Hamilton. His whole perspective on what is necessary and what is the good life was different. Jefferson loved liberty and feared tyranny, while Hamilton feared anarchy and loved order. More so than Hamilton, Jefferson was a product of the Enlightenment, and their differing views ultimately led to Jefferson's resignation as Secretary of State during Washington's presidency. Prior to his resignation, however, Hamilton would propose one additional tax, which Jefferson opposed again, a tax on whiskey. A tax on whiskey ended up placing a great burden on trans-Appalachian farmers, that is, those living deep into the Appalachians and beyond, whose livelihood depended on the production and sale of the liquid. The tax on whiskey raised suspicions among Western frontiersmen who already disliked Hamilton's political and economic policies. And in fact, they far more favored Jefferson in the West. Thus, in the summer of 1794, we're still in Washington's presidential administration, some settlers in western Pennsylvania grouped together, destroyed the stills of those who paid the tax, robbed the mail, and halted court proceedings. Washington, on August 7th in 1794, ordered the whiskey rebels to disband and return home. And here's where it really gets interesting. When no response was given by the men, Washington set out with 13,000 militiamen from Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey. This was the largest force Washington had ever put together in his life. At some point, he left the campaign in the hands of others, and he went back to governing the country. People like Hamilton took over and encountered very little resistance. In fact, in the long run, only 20 rebels were captured. 2 were convicted, but then pardoned by Washington. The whiskey rebels were upset because the tax was unfair to them. Unable to transport grain east over the Appalachians due to the difficulty and time required, they needed to distill their surplus grain before it rotted. Their complaint was eloquently argued by the western Pennsylvania resident with the thick French accent, Albert Gallatin. Gallatin, on the other hand, was also able to get the majority of angry people to calm down before the federal military arrived. His brilliant reasoning further ensconced him in the Pennsylvania political consciousness. The nearly 13,000-man reactionary force sent to quell the rebellion was led by none other than George Washington, the only time a sitting president has marched at the head of an army. The primary leader of the rebellion, a lawyer named David Bradford, escaped south to Spanish Louisiana. There, his son David married the sister of Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederate States. While Washington was president, the French Revolution was underway over a number of years, and these next few slides note how a neutrality position was established by Washington. On September 17, 1796, 6 months prior to leaving office, George Washington issued his farewell address wherein he set forth a number of principles he thought would best help maintain the country. And he called for unity. The address, largely influenced by Don Jay, who we remember from the Federalist Papers, and Hamilton, became the cornerstone of American policy, both foreign and domestic. This slide notes the election of John Adams, the second president of the United States. During Adams's administration, the tensions between the Federalists and the Republicans became worse. Eventually, Adams would sign into law the Alien and Sedition Acts. More than anything else, the measures of the acts limited freedom of speech and the press and sought to limit the liberties of immigrants. Indeed, the first 3 acts were aimed directly at French and Irish immigrants, many of whom had made their way to the country and become Republicans and were suspected of harboring revolutionary activity. This slide notes the first 3 acts. Many believe that the Alien and Sedition Acts especially targeted Albert Gallatin. Jefferson thought so. Gallatin was persona non grata with the financial power brokers. As Joseph Ellis in our time has written, Gallatin was the only person in the U.S. who could match Hamilton on financial and economic issues. Adams' wife, Abigail, also disliked Gallatin. Though a faithful U.S. citizen, Gallatin was often the target of foreigner label rhetorical abuse. Gallatin was elected to the United States Senate by the people of Pennsylvania in 1793. Through a technicality, the Hamilton backers were able to have Gallatin not seated in the Senate. Gallatin was then elected to the House of Representatives, where he became a leader along with James Madison. It was Gallatin who formed Congress's Ways and Means Committee, which from then on has held the government accountable for the money it spends. People like Thomas Paine were also targets of the acts, though he was out of the country at the time. In 1796-97, Paine publicly and forcefully in writing railed against George Washington for abandoning him while Paine was in the French prison for nearly a year awaiting execution at the guillotine. Paine stridently wrote that Washington was in fact a phony. In the end, though, it was Paine's reputation that was most injured from the publication. An example of the use of the Alien and Sedition Acts was the arrest of Irish Republican Congressman Matthew Lyon, who was put in jail for 4 months and fined $1,000 for publishing a censure concerning Adams' continual grab for power. So, to combat the acts, Madison and Jefferson drafted what have become known as the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. The resolutions argued that the states have the rights to nullify any act which would appear to the states to be against their best interest. These two resolutions would set the stage for future conflicts between the federal government and the states. Finally, it was time for Adams to seek re-election, but his party was beginning to split. Running against Adams was Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Disliked by many, Adams received 65 electoral votes, not enough to defeat Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who had each received 73 electoral votes, so it was a tie. The matter of the tie for President of the United States was turned over to the House of Representatives, and it has been acknowledged that it was the in-house work of Albert Gallatin that won the presidency for Jefferson. His good deed would not go unnoticed by Jefferson. The election of 1800 was unique in the fact that it was the first time ever that one political party, the Federalist, peacefully handed the reins of power to a different political party, the Democratic Republican.